I waited in the car while they sorted out dinner plans, or so they said. The engine was off, the air still, and the only sound was the ticking of the dashboard clock. I could see them through the glass walls of the restaurant, smiling, toasting, taking pictures like they didn't know I was still out there. No one looked back, no one waved, not even a message to say, "We're coming." I just sat there, hands folded, like I didn't pay for the gas, like I didn't drive them here, like I wasn't the reason they could even afford this night. And while they laughed and posed with their wine glasses held high, I sat still, watching. What they didn't know, or maybe forgot, was that everything they were enjoying was in my name. Thank you for sitting with me. I know stories like mine aren't easy to listen to, especially if you've ever been the one left behind, not just at a table or a door, but in a life you helped build. If you've ever stood quietly while others acted like your seat didn't matter, if you've ever smiled through something that broke your spirit just to keep the peace, then I hope you stay with me. Because this isn't just about dinner, it's about years of being useful, but never included, generous, but rarely remembered. Tell me where you're listening from if you feel like it, and if any part of this sounds like something you've been through, you can share that too. Or not. It's enough to just be here. I'm 67, though some mornings I feel older in my bones than the number ever suggests. I've raised 3, buried 2, my own parents, and stretched a single paycheck across too many years to count. I've seen hard times, the kind that don't get talked about in public. Times when I warmed the house with the oven door cracked open, when I smiled through Christmas dinner without a roast on the table, and no one knew the light stayed on because I let something else go unpaid. But I made it through. Quietly, like most of us do. My son Jason was soft-hearted as a boy. Thoughtful, curious, always reaching for my hand when we crossed the street. I used to pack little notes in his lunchbox when he was small, just to remind him how loved he was. I never imagined a time would come when he'd forget the woman who used to hold his fevered head through the night, who sat in cold bleachers just to watch him wave from the field. But time has a way of shaping people, or maybe unshaping them. He married a woman named Elle. She was neat, particular, always corrected the way I said things. She liked clean lines, crisp collars, dinners with 5 courses and no casseroles. I tried. I really did. I bit my tongue more times than I can count. When they said we should all take a trip together, just the 3 of us, it sounded sweet at first. A weekend away, they said. A little family reset. I nodded, not because I needed the trip, but because I wanted the company. I offered to drive, paid for the gas without a word. When the Airbnb total came in, I just pulled out my card. Jason said, "We'll get the next one," and Elle smiled like that meant something. I didn't mind. I've always believed in taking care of mine, and I never expected a receipt for kindness. But slowly, across that weekend, I noticed the small things. They didn't ask what I wanted to eat. Didn't ask if I slept well. I was there, but not part of the shape they formed. They posed for pictures with their heads tilted together, always 2, never 3. I stood to the side and took the photos for them. I carried the bags. I adjusted the thermostat. And when it came time to choose a restaurant for dinner, I was still the one who drove. But not the one they brought in. It's strange how someone can be so present and still be invisible. I was never asked to take a seat, just expected to carry the weight. We pulled up to the restaurant just before sunset. The sky was soft and golden, and the trees along the sidewalk looked like they had been painted just for that evening. I had driven us there, hands tight on the steering wheel from trying not to hit a single bump, making sure Elle's shoes didn't get scuffed in the trunk, and Jason's jacket stayed pressed. It was the kind of place that had valet service and linen napkins, not somewhere I would have picked. But I said nothing. I parked near the entrance, engine off, and before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt, Jason leaned forward with a half smile and said, "Mom, can you just wait here for a minute while we sort the reservation?" I blinked, looked at him, then at Elle, who was already reaching for the door handle like I had agreed. I didn't want to make a fuss. I thought maybe there was some mix-up, maybe the reservation was under one name and needed fixing. Maybe it was nothing. So I smiled and said, "Sure, take your time." I thought it'd be 5 minutes. I sat back, adjusted the rearview mirror, watched them disappear into the glass doors like they had somewhere more important to be. 5 minutes passed. Then 15. I kept checking the screen of my phone, but there were no messages, no missed calls. Just the soft buzz of the world moving around me, the valet nodding at the next guest, the clink of plates and glasses echoing from the open-air patio. I cracked the window, hoping for a breeze. It was getting warm. 30 minutes passed. I shifted in my seat. People walked by, some giving me strange looks, like I didn't belong, like I was waiting for someone who forgot to bring me in. I leaned slightly, peering through the glass, and there they were, sitting by the window. Jason had his sleeves rolled, smiling wide, laughing. Elle had her hand on his arm, tilting her phone just right to catch the perfect shot of their wine glasses clinking. I watched her snap the photo, turn the screen toward him, and they both smiled. Toasted. Took another sip. No one looked my way. No one even checked to see if I was still outside. I didn't knock. I didn't text. I just watched. My hands rested in my lap, and my eyes burned, not from the heat, but from the cold realization settling in my chest. I wasn't part of the dinner plan. I was the ride. Nothing more. They had walked in with me in their rear view, and somehow, I had become the background to their evening. And the worst part wasn't being left out. It was knowing they didn't even think of it as cruel, just convenient. A valet walked past the car and looked at me twice. Not in a curious way, not even with concern. Just that quick flicker of a glance, like he wasn't sure if I was waiting for someone or had simply been left there. I lowered my eyes and pretended to adjust the air vents, even though the air had gone still a long time ago. The sun was dipping lower, painting the edge of the dashboard in gold, but it felt like nothing warm could reach me. I glanced back toward the restaurant window, and they were still there. Plates half full, glasses refreshed, smiles untouched by anything beyond their little bubble. Jason leaned toward Elle and said something that made her tilt her head back and laugh, the kind of laugh that fills a room but empties something in the person watching from the outside. I watched her touch his sleeve, gesture toward the menu, and it hit me. This wasn't a delay. There was no mix-up at the front desk. No table waiting for 3. I wasn't forgotten. I was never invited. My stomach turned, not from hunger, but from that deep, sinking drop you feel when the truth lands without warning. All the signs had been there. The way Elle never really looked at me when she spoke. The way Jason started calling less. The holiday dinners where I was always the first to arrive and the last to be acknowledged. I had let myself believe I was still part of something, still needed, still welcome. But that night, in that parking lot, I saw it for what it was. I was the helper, the planner, the driver, the one who funded the memories but didn't get to live in them. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had braided his hair when he was small, wiped down countertops between double shifts, packed lunches in the dark so he'd have a full stomach even when I didn't. Those hands weren't shaking. They weren't clenched. They just rested there quietly, like they were used to waiting. And in that moment, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel rage. What I felt was something colder, something quieter, the knowing. That sharp, aching clarity that settles in your chest when your heart finally catches up to what your eyes have been trying to deny. It wasn't just dinner. It wasn't just one night. It was the shape of things now. The pattern. The quiet exclusion that looks polite on the outside but feels like erasure from the inside. I was still in the car not because they forgot, but because they had already moved on from the idea that I should be anywhere else. I wasn't upset. They had a table for 2. I was hurt. They never imagined it needed to be for 3. And when I looked back through that window and saw the life they were building together, all shiny and curated, I realized they had left the parts of me that mattered out of it entirely. I wasn't angry. I was just done pretending not to see it. It wasn't the first time I'd been set aside. That night in the car just made it harder to keep ignoring what had already been showing itself in smaller, quieter ways. I remember last month, Elle had hosted one of her dinner parties, polished, themed, right down to the gold-trimmed name cards and tiny rosemary sprigs tied to the napkins with twine. She'd invited a few couples from their neighborhood, and Jason called and said, "You should come, Mom. Elle wants the whole family together." I baked my old sweet potato pie, the one with the browned butter crust. The one Jason used to ask for every year when he was little. I wrapped it in foil and held it carefully on my lap the whole ride over, like I was bringing something of myself with it. When I walked into the kitchen, Elle smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She said, "Oh, that's sweet. But we already have dessert." Then she handed the pie off to the neighbor, asked if she could put it in her fridge for later. Like it was a bag of leftovers someone forgot to take home. I stood there, still holding the empty dish towel I'd wrapped it in, and nodded like it didn't sting. No one said thank you. No one asked about the recipe. No one even uncovered it. I stayed in the kitchen most of the night. Not out of choice, but because there was nowhere set for me at the table. All the seats were claimed. The place cards had names I didn't recognize, people who laughed easily and shared stories that didn't have room for mine. I leaned against the island, hands folded, smiling when someone made eye contact, pretending I was just there to help. I offered to refill drinks, cleared plates when no one noticed, stacked empty glasses near the sink. At one point, they raised their glasses to toast, chosen family, and I stood quietly behind them, holding an empty tray, like part of the wallpaper. No one turned around. No one pulled me in. Later, when the last guest left and the candles burned low, I started washing the dishes. Not because I was asked, not because I wanted to, but because it felt easier than walking out into the night with nothing to hold. Jason passed by once and said, "Thanks, Mom," in that soft, distracted way people speak when they're not really seeing you. I finished the dishes, dried my hands, grabbed my purse, and let myself out the side door. Alone. No one called after me. No one noticed the pie still untouched in the neighbor's fridge. So when I was sitting in that car outside the restaurant, watching them through the window as they lifted their glasses again, it wasn't a surprise. Not really. It just confirmed what the pie had already told me. What the quiet moments had been whispering for a while now. I had become convenient, expected, invisible. The one who brings things, cleans up, drives, pays, and stays out of the picture. It's a strange ache to be surrounded by people who share your blood and still feel like you're standing just outside the room. But it's even stranger when you realize they're perfectly fine with you staying there. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't knock on the restaurant door. I didn't press the horn or call their names. I just sat there a little while longer, long enough to let the last sliver of hope dissolve on its own. Then, slowly, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed, steady and low, and I shifted into reverse without looking back at the glass. They were still laughing, still clinking glasses, still perfectly comfortable in a world where I had already been removed. I eased out of the parking lot, one turn at a time, no sudden movement, no drama. Just me and the weight of understanding sitting quietly beside me in the passenger seat. There was no rage bubbling in my chest, no urge to scream or slam anything shut. What I felt was relief. A strange kind of calm that settles over you when you stop reaching for a door that only opens one way. As I pulled into the main road and drove past the dimming storefronts, I didn't think about what I'd missed at dinner. I thought about everything they'd taken for granted. The car they arrived in, the one now sitting in that parking lot, wasn't in Jason's name. It was mine. Registered, insured, and maintained because I had kept paying on it since the day he said he couldn't afford the down payment. And the credit card that booked their fancy hotel, the one Elle had waved at the desk clerk with a smile like she was holding the world in her palm, that was my account. Extended for emergencies, still open under my signature because they promised they'd pay it off next month. The phone they posted their dinner selfies from, the one that uploaded snapshots of toasts and perfectly plated entrees. That phone was part of the family plan I had never taken them off of, because Jason once said it was just easier that way. I thought about those things not out of spite, but because for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't powerless. I hadn't just been cast aside, I had been holding up the very foundation of their comfort while they acted like I was no longer part of it. And maybe that's why it felt so quiet inside the car as I drove. No anger, no sadness. Just a deep breath, full and even, because I remembered something they didn't. I still had the keys. Not just to the car, but to the things they had built their lives on without ever pausing to ask if I still wanted to carry it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the streetlights had flickered on. The house was dark, and the night was soft around the edges, as if it too was giving me space to think. I sat in the driver's seat a moment longer, hands still on the wheel, not because I was frozen, but because I was finally steady. Everything they had built on borrowed trust and quiet expectation was still tied to me, and if they could walk past me without a glance, I could walk away with the same silence. Only difference was, I wouldn't be the one missing out this time. When I got home, I didn't turn on the television or rush to change out of my clothes. I didn't pace the floor or replay every moment of the evening. I walked into my kitchen, set my purse on the counter, and lit the candle by the sink. The soft flicker was steady, like it was reminding me to breathe slow and deep. I stood there for a while, listening to the silence in my own home, the kind that doesn't feel lonely, just honest. Then I walked to the desk in the back room and pulled out the little notepad where I keep names, numbers, and account details. I ran my fingers down the page until I found what I was looking for. I sat down, picked up the phone, and dialed. The man who handles my finances answered with that warm, professional tone he always has. I told him I needed to make a few changes. Quick ones. I asked him to remove Jason and Elle from every card they were linked to. I said I wanted the car payments redirected, the title flagged for recovery, and the extended credit line terminated. I gave him every detail calmly, clearly, without a tremble in my voice. Then I paused. He waited a beat and asked me, "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I let that question sit in the air a moment, and I said, "I've never been more sure." There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. I wasn't acting out of anger. I was cleaning up a mess I should have addressed long ago. Because what they had taken wasn't just money or convenience. It was the quiet confidence that I would always say yes, that I would keep the door open no matter how many times they walked through without acknowledging who was still standing behind it. That door was now closed. Not locked with bitterness, but with clarity. We went through every account one by one. He confirmed each cancellation, each removal, each reset. I thanked him when we were done, and he told me he'd follow up with documentation in the morning. I hung up and sat there a while longer, the candle still burning gently beside me. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like return. Like finally stepping back into ownership of things I had slowly handed over without notice. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply reminding them that everything they had leaned on came from somewhere, and someone. And if they could forget that, then I had every right to remember it for them. Quietly. Fully. And without asking permission. The next morning, just as the sun began to stretch through the slats of my blinds, I woke without an alarm. I didn't feel tired, not the way I usually do after a restless night. I felt still, settled, like something inside of me had been quietly put back where it belonged. I moved through the house with purpose, not rushing, not dragging. I folded a throw blanket on the couch, watered the plant by the window, then walked into the kitchen and filled the kettle. As it began to warm, my phone buzzed on the counter beside me. I glanced at it, not expecting much, and saw Jason's name blinking across the screen. The message said, "Mom, the car's not here? Did you move it?" I stared at those words for a long time. Not because they surprised me, but because they landed with such precision. Not a question about how I was or where I was. Just panic over the absence of something they had assumed would always be there. I didn't reply. I turned the burner down to low and watched the kettle rock gently on its base. A few minutes later, another message came through. "Our phones aren't working? Can you fix the plan?" That one made me exhale, soft and slow. It wasn't anger or even disappointment I felt. It was recognition. The same way you look at a cracked plate and finally understand it's not going to hold what it used to. I sipped my tea, now warm enough to drink, and leaned against the counter as the third message arrived. Short. Blunt. "Did you do this?" I didn't answer that one either. I turned the ringer off, placed the phone face down, and walked into the living room. The sun was pushing through stronger now, brushing the tops of the curtains in gold. I sat in my chair, the one near the window with the worn arms and quiet view, and let the quiet cover me like a soft blanket. I wasn't gloating. I wasn't celebrating. There was no smile on my face. There was only a long, overdue peace stretching through my chest, where all the hurt had lived for too long. They had built their comfort on the idea that I would always be available, always be silent, always keep giving even when they stopped seeing me. And now, they were being introduced to the cost of that comfort, the part that had never come free but was given without question. Until now. I thought of the dinners, the rides, the bills quietly paid, the strings they never saw because I never let them show. Now they felt the absence, not of a thing, but of a person. A presence they had mistaken for background noise, now silent. I didn't reply, not because I didn't have words, but because I had already said everything that needed to be said with action. There's something powerful about letting someone sit with the weight of their choices. Not to punish them, but to let them feel the echo of their own decisions. I wasn't going to rush in and soften the landing this time. They would learn, the way most people do, not from being told but from being left to feel it for themselves. As I sat there with my tea, I looked out the window and watched a pair of birds settle on the fence. The sky was clear, the morning quiet, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, like I had taken up space in my own life again. Not as a provider, not as an accessory to someone else's comfort, but as someone with limits, value, and the strength to hold both. Let them figure it out. Let them ask their questions. I had already answered the one that mattered. I chose myself. Quietly, completely, and without asking for permission. That evening, just as I was folding the laundry in the living room with the soft hum of the dryer still rattling in the background, there was a gentle knock at the door. Not loud, not hurried. Just one of those quiet knocks that carries care in it, like someone hoping not to startle you. I walked over and opened it, and there she was, Lila. She stood there with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater, eyes kind and steady, the way they've always been since she was small. She didn't say anything right away. She just stepped in, wrapped her arms around me, and held on. It wasn't one of those quick, polite hugs. It was the kind that lingers, the kind that lets you breathe deeper without realizing you needed to. I closed my eyes for a moment and let myself lean into it, not because I was falling apart, but because it felt good to be seen. When she pulled back, she looked around the room like she was trying to measure how quiet things had been all day. And then she sat on the edge of the couch, without waiting to be invited. She said, "I saw the photos they posted," and her voice cracked just enough to let me know she hadn't come to talk about the weather. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and she meant it, not just for the pictures, but for all the things that led up to them. I sat beside her, folded my hands in my lap, and looked out the window for a moment before I answered. I told her, "It's not the photo. It's who they think should be cropped out." She nodded like she already knew. Because she did. Lila had always paid attention, even when others didn't. She noticed when I sat alone during family gatherings, noticed when I cooked but didn't eat, noticed when I arrived early and left late but never made it into the group chats or albums. She was young, but her eyes had never skimmed past the things that mattered. That's what made her different. She didn't look through me. She looked at me. And that day, she brought more comfort with her quiet presence than any apology could have carried. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She stayed a while, long enough for the room to feel less empty. Long enough for me to remember that even when some turn their backs, someone always sees you. She helped me fold the rest of the laundry, one towel at a time, like we had all the time in the world. And when it was done, she stood and hugged me again, tighter this time, like she didn't want to let go. Before she walked out the door, she looked back and said, "You deserved better." I nodded, and I said, "Yes, but I'm giving myself better now." She smiled at that. Not the kind of smile people give when they're trying to cheer you up, but the kind that says they believe you. And when the door clicked shut behind her, I sat there in the quiet, but it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt honest, lighter, because even though the ones closest to you might forget who you are, someone always remembers. Someone always sees the whole picture. And sometimes, all it takes is one person noticing to remind you that you were never invisible. Not really. It was 2 days later when Jason showed up at my door. No call ahead. No warning. just the soft rumble of a car pulling into the driveway that used to feel like home to him. I saw him through the window, standing there with his shoulders drawn in tight, the same way he did when he knew he had something to say, but didn't quite know how to begin. I opened the door before he could knock, and for a second we just looked at each other. No words, no movement, just two people standing in the same air, carrying two very different versions of the same silence. He finally stepped inside, eyes rimmed with that tired red that comes from a few nights of poor sleep and too much thinking. He didn't sit. He just stood there near the hallway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like the floor might give out. Then he said, "Mom, what you did, that was extreme." His voice cracked a little, but he tried to hold it steady. I walked slowly to the chair by the window and sat down. I didn't motion for him to join me. I just looked at him, hands folded in my lap, and said, "Was it more extreme than leaving your mother in a car while you toasted to new beginnings?" He didn't answer right away. He looked down at the floor like the truth was written there and he didn't want to read it. I watched him swallow hard, like the words he wanted to say were stuck somewhere between pride and guilt. But I didn't fill the space. I let him sit in it. Because sometimes silence teaches more than speeches ever could. After a moment he said, "We didn't think it would take that long. Elle thought it would be better to check the table first." I didn't mean for it to feel like. And I stopped him right there, calmly. Not cold, just certain. "You didn't mean for it to feel like I didn't belong? Or you didn't mean to get caught in the act of forgetting I ever did?" He looked at me then, fully. And I held that gaze, not with anger, but with clarity. I said, "You walked past me. With your eyes, with your choices, with every moment you made space for someone else to belong while I waited outside, wondering what I had done to deserve the car, but not the seat at the table." He ran a hand down his face like he was trying to wipe off the guilt, but it didn't budge. He said, "I didn't think. I just..." But he didn't finish. And I didn't need him to. Because the truth had already shown itself. Not in his words, but in his actions. In the way he had made comfort more important than care. Appearances more important than presence. And I wasn't going to soften that, just because he finally noticed the cost. I told him, "This isn't about money. It never was. It's about being treated like a burden in moments I built. It's about being erased from the story in rooms I paid to keep warm." He didn't argue. He couldn't. He stood there with his head slightly lowered, and for the first time in a long time, I saw him not as the boy I raised, but as the man who had grown comfortable, walking ahead without looking back. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't beg to be understood. I just let the truth hang there between us, solid and unmoving. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is stand still while the other finally sees what they left behind. He asked if there was anything he could do to make it right. I told him, "That depends on whether you want to fix the image or the wound." He nodded, but I don't think he knew the difference yet. That's not something I could teach him in one conversation. That's something he'll have to earn in the spaces between silence and sincerity. And as he walked toward the door slower than when he came in, I stayed seated, watching. Not out of spite, but out of peace. Because I knew now that my worth wasn't tied to whether or not someone made room for me. I had found my voice, and I had chosen not to raise it, but to root it. And there's nothing louder than that. If you've ever been asked to wait quietly while others decided your worth, then you already know what it feels like to sit in silence, hoping someone will notice you still exist. If you've ever stood on the outside of a moment you helped build, if you've ever brought the food, paid the fare, set the table, only to be left out of the picture, then I hope you know you're not alone. I waited. More times than I should have. I smiled through it, thinking they'd see me eventually. But sometimes, seeing yourself clearly means walking away from people who don't look back. I didn't drive away in anger. I drove away because I had finally remembered who I was and what I no longer needed to prove. If any part of this feels familiar, tell me. Or if it's easier, just write. I waited. That's enough. I'll understand. And if you're watching this alone tonight, you don't have to stay invisible here. I do hope you will subscribe and know that you matter. You are seen, you are remembered. Thank you for watching.